The enduring image of the Blitz is one of national unity, the stoic Londoner, the cup of tea among the rubble, a people united by shared sacrifice. But the overlooked fact is that the Blitz was not a single campaign. It was actually three distinct phases, each driven by a different German strategic calculation. And each phase revealed a different fault line in British society. The first phase was precise. The Luftwaffe began with daylight raids aimed at military targets, airfields, radar stations, and the factories feeding the Battle of Britain. When that failed to break the RAF, they changed targets. On September 7, 1940, the Germans switched to night bombing of cities. And in doing so, they made a decision that would test the limits of civilian endurance and reveal something the bombers did not anticipate. The human story of the Blitz is not simply about endurance. It's also about the overlooked infrastructure, the wardens, the firefighters, the women of the Auxiliary Territorial Service that held a modern city together while it was being systematically destroyed. The German strategy for the Blitz was born from frustration. Göring had promised Hitler that his air force would destroy the RAF in just a few weeks. But by early September, it was clear he could not. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe launched its first major raid against London, targeting the docks. The fires burned for days. The city had never seen anything like it. This was the first overlooked condition. The Germans believed bombing cities would break civilian morale. They had studied the Spanish Civil War, where the bombing of Guernica had terrorized the population. They assumed London would react the same way. What they did not account for was the British government's decision, made weeks before the bombing began, to create a civil defense infrastructure that could absorb the shock. Air raid wardens, fire services, ambulance crews, they were already in place. The second overlooked decision was the distribution of air raid shelters. The government initially did not want the public using the underground, fearing they would stay there permanently. By the third week of bombing, the policy had collapsed. Londoners simply walked into the tube stations and, well, they just refused to leave. The government realized that stopping them would create more chaos than allowing them to stay. The bombing itself was inconsistent. The Luftwaffe lacked a heavy bomber capable of delivering the tonnage required to level a city. Their aircraft were designed for tactical support of ground forces, not strategic bombing. This led to the third overlooked fact: the bombing disproportionately hit working-class neighborhoods. The East End, with its docks, warehouses, and dense housing, was the primary target. The West End, where the government ministries were located, was largely spared. The class dimension of the Blitz was immediate and visible. The Queen famously said she could now look the East End in the face, a remark that acknowledged, however obliquely, the political danger of perceived inequality and suffering. The psychological resilience that became the Blitz's legend was not a natural phenomenon, it was manufactured. The government invested heavily in propaganda, posters, films, radio broadcasts that framed endurance as a patriotic duty. The second phase of the Blitz began in November 1940, when the Germans shifted from London to industrial cities: Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow. Coventry was the most destructive single raid of the Blitz. The Germans had developed a technique, using Pathfinder aircraft to drop flares and incendiaries, followed by waves of bombers. The city center was obliterated. The British had broken the German Enigma code and knew Coventry was the target. The decision not to evacuate the city in advance, to avoid revealing that the code had been broken, remains one of the most debated choices of the war. Buckingham Palace was bombed during this phase. The king and queen were in residence at the time. The fact that the palace had been hit, that the monarchy shared the danger, became a powerful symbolic counterweight to the class tensions of the early raids. The third phase began in the spring of 1941, when the Germans launched what they called the Baedeker Blitz, raids targeting historic cities not for military value, but for cultural significance. Bath, Canterbury, and York were hit. By May 1941, the Blitz ended. Hitler had made his decision. The invasion of the Soviet Union required the Luftwaffe in the east. The bombers left for the Russian front. The Blitz had lasted 8 months. Over 40,000 British civilians were killed. More than 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. So, the German strategic assessment after the Blitz was that bombing cities had, well, failed to break British morale. The Luftwaffe actually concluded that strategic bombing against a prepared civilian population was, in the end, ineffective. The doctrine that emerged from the Blitz, that civilian populations could be bombed into submission, ended up shaping the air campaigns for the rest of the war. Harris's bomber command would go on to take the techniques the Germans had developed, the Pathfinders, the incendiaries, the night raids, and, apply them to Hamburg, to Dresden, and to Berlin. The Blitz also changed Britain in ways that outlasted the war. The experience of shared danger, however unevenly distributed, created an expectation of collective responsibility that shaped the post-war welfare state. The shelters, the fire services, the emergency medical system. These were not temporary measures. They became the template for a peacetime social contract that assumed the state had a duty to protect its citizens from harm. The Blitz, then, was not a victory. It was a campaign the Germans lost because they underestimated the durability of a society that had built the infrastructure to endure. But the British paid for that lesson in the language of rubble, fire, and 40,000 civilian dead. Subscribe to War Machiner and share this if you value history that goes deeper.